Mom! Oh my God! Mom! The billionaire's voice sliced through the brutally cold morning air like a knife. His mother, frail and vulnerable, was leaning against the stone wall by the mansion gate. She was barefoot, her pale feet stark against the snow, held tightly in the protective embrace of a thin, young black teenager. He was wrapped in a worn-out, threadbare blanket. Overcome with gratitude and still visibly shaken, the billionaire vowed to help the young man rebuild his shattered life. He had no idea that this single act of compassion, born out of a desperate situation, would transform his own life in ways he couldn't even begin to fathom. Before we delve deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories delivered to you every single day. William Hartwell's hands were shaking so violently, he could barely grip the luxurious leather steering wheel of his sleek Mercedes-Benz. The heated seats were doing absolutely nothing to warm the icy dread that was spreading rapidly through his chest, chilling him to the bone. The private jet had touched down at precisely 5:47 in the morning, much earlier than originally scheduled. He'd cut the crucial California conference short, driven by a relentless, gnawing feeling deep inside him, a feeling he simply couldn't shake off. It was something about his mother's voice on the phone last night, the unsettling confusion in her tone, the way she'd repeatedly called him by his deceased father's name. The December snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, the kind that seemed to absorb all sound, creating an eerie silence and transforming the world into a pristine, almost surreal snow globe. His sprawling mansion loomed ahead, all 12,000 square feet of it, a monument to his success. It was dark except for the welcoming porch lights, which he'd set on an automatic timer. Home, he thought, though lately it felt more like a sterile museum he just happened to sleep in. William pressed the remote. The imposing iron gates swung open with their usual, almost arrogant mechanical precision. He'd paid an exorbitant $23,000 for those gates. State-of-the-art, incredibly secure, undeniably safe, or so he had naively thought. Then his eyes swept across the vast property, and his blood turned to ice water. The pedestrian gate, the small side entrance he'd been meaning to have the security company examine for weeks, was hanging wide open, its sophisticated electronic lock blinking a frantic red. Malfunctioning, utterly failed, just like everything else he trusted to keep his precious mother safe and sound. Time seemed to stop, the world holding its breath. His 78-year-old mother, Eleanor Hartwell, was slumped pathetically against the cold stone column of the portico, wearing nothing but her thin, utterly inadequate cotton nightgown, the familiar blue one with the tiny faded flowers she'd worn faithfully since his father had passed away. Her feet were bare, exposed to the unforgivingly frozen marble. Her elegant silver hair hung loose around her fragile face, wild and tangled, a stark contrast to her usual impeccably groomed appearance. But she wasn't alone, and that was perhaps the most shocking part of all. A young black man, barely more than a teenager, maybe 19 or 20, impossibly thin, wearing a threadbare sweater so worn William could clearly see the sharp outline of his ribs through it, had wrapped himself protectively around Eleanor like a human shield. His arms encircled her trembling body, his own frame curved protectively over hers. Between them, William could see the corner of what appeared to be a blanket, gray and sadly moth-eaten, barely big enough to adequately cover a child, let alone two shivering people. Both of them were shaking uncontrollably. Not the normal shiver of simple cold, but the violent, uncontrollable tremors of bodies rapidly shutting down, teetering on the brink of collapse. "Mom!" The raw scream tore from William's throat before he even realized he'd thrown open the car door. He ran desperately, his ridiculously expensive $1,000 shoes slipping precariously on the treacherous ice, his elegant cashmere coat flying open wildly behind him. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" The young man's eyes flickered open, dark brown and bloodshot, barely focused on William. His lips were a frightening shade of blue. His skin had taken on a sickening grayish tinge that William instantly recognized from his EMT training years ago. A lifetime ago, it seemed. Back when he was still a naive college student, back before the overwhelming money and the sprawling empire and the ever-growing distance from everything that was truly real and important in life. Hypothermia, advanced stage, he realized with a sickening jolt. She was lost, the young man whispered, his voice cracking like fragile breaking ice. Each agonizing word seemed to cost him everything he had. Couldn't leave her. William fell heavily to his knees, instinctively pulling his mother gently into his trembling arms. She was ice cold to the touch, but she was breathing, however shallowly. Alive, miraculously alive. "Who are you?" William asked the young man, hot tears streaming uncontrollably down his anguished face. "How long have you been out here in this weather?" "All night," the young man said simply, his voice barely a breath, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed, utterly unconscious. "No, no, no!" William caught him before he could fall heavily, lowering him as gently as he possibly could to the unforgiving steps while simultaneously reaching for his mother, desperate to keep her safe. "Stay with me, both of you. Please just stay with me." His mother's eyes fluttered open, confused and clouded, utterly lost in the impenetrable fog of Alzheimer's that had been worsening dramatically over the last 3 agonizing years, though she'd been officially diagnosed long before that. "Richard," she murmured softly, using William's beloved father's name. "Is it time for breakfast already?" William's heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Can you even imagine finding your mother in a situation like this? Discovering that a complete stranger, a seemingly homeless young man, had bravely risked his own life to save hers while you were away, preoccupied with business? But to truly understand how we arrived at this incredibly dramatic moment, we need to go back to where it all tragically began, about 8 hours earlier. Thomas Wheeler had precisely $17.43 to his name when the gruff but not entirely unkind landlord of the dilapidated boarding house abruptly threw him out onto the frigid street. "I've been patient with you, kid," Mr. Tommy said, his voice laced with a weary resignation. "But you're 3 weeks behind on the rent now. I got a business to run here, you know." "I have a job interview tomorrow," Thomas pleaded desperately. "At the warehouse, they said they're actively hiring for the loading docks. If I get the job, I can definitely pay you by Friday, I promise." Mr. Tommy simply shook his head sadly. "You've said that before, son. I'm genuinely sorry, Thomas. I really am, but you gotta go now." So Thomas reluctantly packed all of his meager belongings into his worn-out backpack. 3 faded shirts, 2 threadbare pairs of jeans, a toothbrush, a half-empty water bottle, and carefully wrapped in a protective layer of plastic at the very bottom, his cherished mother's old blanket, and a single, faded photograph of her. Everything he owned in the entire world fit into that one bag, a testament to his poverty. He was just 19 years old, barely an adult. He'd been completely on his own since he was 16, when his beloved mother had tragically died. 3 long, incredibly difficult years of simply surviving day by day, doing whatever odd jobs he could find, washing dishes in greasy diners, moving heavy boxes in dimly lit warehouses, anything at all that paid cash, however little, under the table because he had no official papers, no social security card, absolutely no proof that he even existed beyond the color of his skin. Thomas stood forlornly on the cracked sidewalk outside the rundown boarding house, his breath clouding instantly in the freezing December air, and desperately tried to figure out where he could possibly go. The homeless shelter was already completely full, bursting at the seams. It always was this time of year, when temperatures plummeted into the dangerous teens and the unrelenting cold turned deadly. The temporary warming center downtown wouldn't open its doors until morning, and even then, all the available spots would undoubtedly be gone, snapped up by others just as desperate as he was. He'd shown up too late again, a recurring theme in his young life. Thomas stood silently outside the imposing shelter doors for a long moment, watching the stark red "no vacancy" light flicker ominously in the icy wind, then reluctantly turned away, defeated. His stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of his empty state. He'd skipped dinner the night before in a desperate attempt to save precious money. The paltry $17.43 remaining in his pocket absolutely needed to last until he could somehow, miraculously, find more work. He started walking aimlessly, with no real destination in mind, simply moving to try to stay even slightly warm. His jacket was pathetically thin, bought from a second-hand store 2 years ago for a mere $5. It had been just barely adequate in the early autumn, but now, with winter pressing down hard and mercilessly, it was barely better than wearing nothing at all. Downtown was still alive with bright lights and activity. People were inside cozy restaurants, laughing and chatting happily over steaming hot meals. Cheerful holiday music spilled out from brightly decorated stores. Taxis honked impatiently in the distance. Office windows glowed warmly with the lights of late-night workers finishing their long days. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere important, doing something meaningful, belonging to someone special. Thomas, on the other hand, belonged absolutely nowhere. He thought about his mother as he walked, the memories flooding his mind. He thought specifically about her final agonizing days in the overcrowded charity ward of the county hospital. Her once vibrant body ravaged by the relentless cancer they simply couldn't afford to properly treat. He thought about how she'd gripped his small hand with surprising strength. Her eyes filled with a fierce determination, and made him solemnly promise her something incredibly important. "You'll never truly be poor if you still possess kindness," she'd whispered weakly, her voice barely audible over the constant beeping of the life-sustaining machines that were keeping her alive. "Money always comes and goes, Tommy, but the kind of person you actively choose to be, that stays with you forever. Promise me you'll always stay kind, even when the world isn't kind back to you." "I promise, Mom," 16-year-old Thomas had said through his uncontrollable tears, his voice thick with grief. "And promise me something else," his mother had continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't just survive, baby. Truly live. Actively find joy in the small things. Find good people to love. Build a life that's actually worth living." Thomas had readily promised, but keeping that incredibly important promise had proven to be infinitely harder than he could have ever imagined. By early evening, Thomas found himself wandering through a wealthy neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city. He hadn't intentionally meant to come here. He'd simply walked, blindly following one unfamiliar street after another, desperately trying to stay warm and somewhat alert, and somehow ended up completely surrounded by opulent mansions that looked like something straight out of a glamorous movie. Imposing stone walls, elaborate iron gates, ubiquitous security cameras, houses with more rooms than Thomas could even begin to count. He kept his head down and his hands firmly tucked into his shallow pockets. He'd learned very early on in his difficult life that looking at the big houses for too long, pausing even briefly in front of the ridiculously expensive cars, immediately got you labeled as suspicious, and being a young black man looking even remotely suspicious in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood almost always meant unwanted and potentially dangerous police attention, something he absolutely couldn't afford. Thomas was cutting through a narrow side street, desperately trying to navigate his way back to a part of town where he actually belonged, when he suddenly heard something that made him stop abruptly in his tracks. Crying, faint and desperate, confused and frightened crying, an elderly person's voice, thin and wavering precariously. Every survival instinct Thomas possessed told him to keep walking, to ignore it and move on. Getting actively involved with other people's problems when you looked the way he did, when you had no permanent address and absolutely no official documentation, was incredibly dangerous. It was precisely the kind of thing that could get you arrested for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the pathetic crying continued, and Thomas found his weary feet moving inexorably toward the heartbreaking sound before his rational brain could effectively override them. The sound was definitely coming from a dark alleyway nestled between two ridiculously large mansions. Thomas cautiously peered into the deep shadows and saw an elderly woman slowly shuffling along, wearing only a thin nightgown and flimsy slippers, clearly disoriented. Her elegant silver hair hung loosely around her fragile face, partially obscuring her features. She was clutching a framed photograph tightly to her chest, her knuckles white with the strain. The glass was visibly cracked, and she was crying softly to herself, utterly lost and deeply confused. "Ma'am," Thomas called out gently, approaching her slowly and cautiously so as not to startle her further. "Are you okay? Are you lost, ma'am?" The woman slowly turned to him, her eyes clouded and tragically unfocused. "I have to find William," she said, her voice trembling precariously. "My son." He's patiently waiting for me at the train station. I'm terribly late, I'm so very late. Thomas's heart sank with a heavy weight of understanding. He immediately recognized the unmistakable signs. His own grandmother had been exactly the same way before she sadly died when he was just 10 years old. Alzheimer's, he realized with a sinking feeling. This poor woman was clearly having an episode. "What's your name, ma'am?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice as calm and gentle as humanly possible. "Eleanor," she said softly, clutching the cracked picture frame even tighter to her chest. "Eleanor Hartwell, and I desperately need to find William. He'll be terribly worried about me." Thomas quickly looked around their immediate surroundings. They were trapped between two massive estates, each one seemingly larger than the last. There were absolutely no other houses nearby, no comforting signs of human habitation. There was no one else on the desolate street. Darkness was falling rapidly now, shrouding them both in an increasingly dangerous cold. Eleanor was wearing only a pathetically thin nightgown and inadequate house slippers, utterly insufficient protection from the brutal elements. Her poor feet must be absolutely freezing, he thought with growing concern. "Eleanor," Thomas said gently, trying to get her attention. "Do you know where you live? Can you possibly tell me your address?" Eleanor's face suddenly crumpled, and she started to sob uncontrollably. "I can't remember," she wailed. "I can't remember where my home is. I just can't remember." She started crying even harder, her frail body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. "Why can't I remember anything?" Thomas felt a surge of overwhelming panic rising rapidly in his chest. This vulnerable woman desperately needed help. She needed to get back home immediately. She needed urgent medical attention. He really should call 911. He knew that was definitely the smart thing to do, the safe and responsible thing to do. But Thomas had learned through bitter experience not to trust the police, especially in affluent neighborhoods. He'd learned that when you were homeless and black, any interactions with law enforcement rarely, if ever, went well. And if they found him here, alone with a confused, elderly white woman who couldn't adequately explain who he was or why he was trying to help her, Thomas simply couldn't risk it. The potential consequences were simply too great. But he also couldn't just abandon her. He simply couldn't bring himself to leave her alone and vulnerable in the freezing cold. "Okay," Thomas said, making a difficult decision. "Okay, Eleanor, let's figure this out together. Okay? Let's just walk around slowly and see if anything looks familiar to you. Maybe we can find your house that way. Okay?" Eleanor nodded slowly, still clutching the precious picture frame tightly to her chest. Thomas glanced briefly at the cracked frame. It was a wedding photo, probably about 40 years old. A young couple smiling brightly, their eyes full of hope and dreams. "Is that you?" Thomas asked gently, pointing to the young woman in the faded photo. "Yes," Eleanor said softly, her voice softening noticeably. "That's me and Richard, my beloved husband. We were so young back then, weren't we? So incredibly happy." "It's a beautiful picture," Thomas said sincerely, gently taking the fragile frame from her trembling hands. "Let me carry this safely for you. Okay? I promise we'll keep it safe. I bet Richard is worried sick about you right now. Let's get you safely home to him as quickly as possible. Okay?" Eleanor readily let him take the frame, seeming immensely relieved to have someone else carry even that small burden. Thomas carefully tucked it into his backpack for safekeeping, vowing to protect it. What Thomas didn't yet know was that Richard, her beloved husband, had been sadly dead for at least 10 long years. The relentless storm had seemingly emptied the streets completely. Even the dedicated dog walkers had wisely decided to stay safely inside their warm homes. Not a single car passed them for what seemed like hours. They walked slowly up the deserted street, Eleanor leaning heavily on Thomas's steady arm for support. She talked almost constantly as they walked, her disjointed conversation wandering aimlessly through time, mixing vivid memories of the past with the stark reality of the present, constantly confusing names and places. "William is such a good boy," she said proudly. "He works so very hard. Too hard, I keep telling him. But he simply won't listen to me. He's always been so stubborn, that boy." "I'm sure he is," Thomas agreed kindly, trying his best to keep her calm and focused, desperately trying to think of what he could possibly do to help her. The temperature was dropping rapidly, becoming more dangerous with each passing minute. Full darkness had completely settled over the wealthy neighborhood, and the elegant street lights were finally beginning to come on, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets. Thomas's thin jacket was doing absolutely nothing to effectively protect him against the biting cold. Eleanor's threadbare nightgown was even thinner, offering her even less protection. "I'm cold," Eleanor said suddenly, shivering uncontrollably. "So terribly cold." Thomas stopped walking abruptly. He looked down at Eleanor, at her bare legs and flimsy slippers, at the way she shook violently with a combination of cold and confusion. He looked up at the darkening sky and the imposing mansions that surrounded them, all locked up tightly behind their elaborate gates and imposing walls, seemingly impervious to the suffering outside. Then Thomas made a spontaneous decision, a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his entire life forever. He thought of all the countless nights he'd spent alone and shivering, when no one had stopped to help him, when the world had coldly looked the other way, indifferent to his suffering. And for some inexplicable reason, he simply couldn't bring himself to do the same to this vulnerable woman. He slowly took off his jacket, his only real protection against the unforgiving cold, and gently wrapped it around Eleanor's shivering shoulders. It hung awkwardly on her small frame, far too big, but it was definitely something, a small shield against the brutal elements. "There," Thomas said, trying to sound far more confident than he actually felt, even though he was already starting to shiver uncontrollably. "That's definitely better now, right?" Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed to focus, becoming remarkably clear for just a fleeting moment. "You gave me your coat," she said wonderingly, "but now you'll be terribly cold." "I'll be perfectly okay," Thomas lied bravely. "I'm tougher than I actually look, I promise." They continued walking slowly. Thomas tried each gate they passed, hoping desperately to recognize Eleanor's house, hoping that someone, anyone, would finally appear and offer some much-needed help. But the street remained eerily empty and silent. These wealthy neighborhoods were strangely like ghost towns, he thought grimly. Everyone was locked away safely inside their luxurious mansions, seemingly completely insulated from the harsh cold and the suffering of the outside world. After about 20 long minutes of slow walking, Eleanor's legs began to give out on her. She stumbled precariously, and Thomas quickly caught her, supporting her entire weight. "I'm so tired," Eleanor whispered weakly. "Can we please just rest for a little while?" Thomas looked around desperately, his mind racing. They were standing in front of one of the biggest mansions he'd ever seen, a sprawling stone behemoth with imposing columns and tall, darkened windows, all dark except for some dim, almost mocking security lights. The elaborate gate was firmly closed, but there was a small stone wall along the perimeter with a recessed alcove near the grand entrance, offering at least some minimal shelter from the worst of the biting wind. "Okay," Thomas said soothingly. "Let's just rest here for a minute. Okay? Just for a little while." He gently helped Eleanor sit down carefully in the alcove, her back resting against the cold stone wall. The ground was incredibly freezing, but at least they were somewhat out of the direct wind. Thomas sat down right next to her, already shivering violently. As he settled down, he suddenly noticed something almost imperceptible. The faintest hint of warmth rising slowly from a small vent near the base of the cold wall. A heating exhaust, he realized with a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, barely even noticeable, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to keep them from actually freezing to death out here. "Tell me about William," Thomas said, trying desperately to keep Eleanor awake and alert, trying to keep her talking, anything to distract them both from the brutal cold. "What's he like, Eleanor?" "He's absolutely wonderful," Eleanor said dreamily, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and worry. "So incredibly smart. He built a successful company completely from nothing. But I worry so much about him. He works far too much, doesn't take any time for himself, doesn't seem to remember what truly matters in life." "What matters, Eleanor?" Thomas asked, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. People, dear, Eleanor said simply. Love, genuine human connection. That's truly all that really matters in the end. Thomas pulled his worn-out backpack around and began digging through it with his increasingly numb fingers. At the very bottom, carefully wrapped in a protective plastic bag, was his precious mother's old blanket, the last tangible piece of her that he had left in the world, thin, worn, and full of holes, but it had been hers, and that made it priceless. It still smelled faintly like her, like home, like everything he'd tragically lost. Thomas had silently sworn to himself that he would absolutely never give this blanket away to anyone. It was all he had left of his beloved mother, a link to his past. But looking at Eleanor, shivering uncontrollably and so deeply confused, so utterly fragile and vulnerable, Thomas knew instinctively what he had to do. He slowly pulled out the precious blanket and carefully wrapped it around both of them, pulling Eleanor close to his side for added warmth. She was so small and frail, her fragile body shook uncontrollably against his. "What's this?" Eleanor asked softly, gently touching the threadbare blanket. "It was my mother's," Thomas said quietly. "She died 3 years ago. This worn blanket is all I have left of her in the world." "Oh," Eleanor said softly, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. "Then you definitely shouldn't waste it on me, dear." "It's definitely not wasted," Thomas said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "My mom would absolutely want me to use it to help someone else. She was always like that. She always believed in actively taking care of people in need." "She sounds like a remarkably good woman," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible. "She was the very best," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. That incredibly thin ribbon of warmth rising gently from the exhaust vent kept them both just barely above fatal temperatures, a fragile lifeline against the brutal cold. They sat huddled tightly together as the outside temperature plummeted even further. Thomas had checked his watch earlier. It was approximately 7:15 p.m. The seemingly endless night was going to be incredibly long and dangerously brutal. Thomas tried desperately to remember everything he'd ever learned about surviving freezing cold nights. Keep moving as much as possible to maintain circulation. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep. That's incredibly dangerous. Stay awake no matter what. Share body heat to conserve energy. But this was different, far more dangerous than anything he'd ever experienced before. This was an incredibly dangerous level of cold, potentially deadly cold, and he had absolutely no proper shelter, no real protection to speak of, and a deeply confused elderly woman who was now completely dependent on him for her very survival. "Tell me about your mother," Eleanor said suddenly, after a long silence, her voice surprisingly weak but genuinely curious. So Thomas reluctantly talked. He told Eleanor all about his mother's infectious laugh, which was incredibly loud and joyful and could instantly light up an entire room. About how she constantly sang while she cooked, even though she couldn't actually carry a tune to save her life. About how she worked tirelessly at 3 grueling jobs to somehow keep them fed and adequately housed, but always somehow still made time to actively help him with his homework, to sincerely ask about his day at school, to show him in countless small ways that he truly mattered to her. "She sounds absolutely wonderful," Eleanor said softly. "She truly was," Thomas said quietly. "She taught me that being poor doesn't automatically mean being unkind, that you can sadly lose everything material and still be incredibly rich if you have a genuinely good heart." "She was absolutely right about that," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Then her tired eyes drifted away, losing focus again. "Is Richard coming soon? He's supposed to pick me up promptly from my dear mother's house." "He'll be here soon, I promise," Thomas said soothingly, even though he was sadly beginning to strongly suspect that Richard, like his own beloved mother, was already long gone. The long hours crawled by slowly, agonizingly slowly. 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Thomas talked almost continuously, telling Eleanor comforting stories, asking her simple questions, doing anything he could possibly think of to keep her awake and somewhat alert. She drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes mistakenly calling him William, sometimes anxiously asking repeatedly for her beloved husband, Richard, sometimes surprisingly clear and seemingly present. During one relatively clear moment around 11 p.m., Eleanor looked directly at Thomas with surprisingly focused eyes. "You're freezing," she said, her voice unusually sharp with genuine concern. "You're going to die out here in this terrible cold, trying desperately to save me." "No, I'm definitely not," Thomas said bravely, though his body had strangely stopped shivering, which he knew deep down was a very bad sign indeed. "We're both going to make it safely through this long night, both of us. I promise you that." "But why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked him directly. "You don't even know me. You could easily leave me here right now. You could still save yourself, you know." Thomas thought deeply about that statement. He thoughtfully considered his mother's wise words. He remembered the solemn promise he'd made to her so long ago. "Because someone needed help," Thomas said simply, "and I just happened to be there. That's definitely reason enough for me, Eleanor." Eleanor reached out slowly with a trembling hand and gently touched his cold face. "Your remarkable mother raised you incredibly well," she whispered softly. "She would be so immensely proud of you right now." Thomas felt hot tears instantly freeze on his cold cheeks. By midnight, Thomas was sadly losing his desperate fight against the relentless hypothermia. His thoughts were becoming increasingly scattered and tragically confused. His vision was blurred and distorted. His weary body felt heavy and distant, like it somehow belonged to someone else entirely. But he bravely kept his protective arms wrapped tightly around Eleanor, kept the threadbare blanket securely wrapped around them both, kept his own failing body firmly positioned between her and the worst of the brutal cold. "Thomas!" Eleanor's voice seemed to be coming from very far away, barely audible. "Are you still there with me?" "Still here," Thomas mumbled weakly, forcing the words slowly through his numb and unresponsive lips. "Please don't leave me," Eleanor said, and she sounded suddenly scared, like a helpless child. "Please don't leave me all alone out here." "Never," Thomas promised her weakly. "I'm definitely not going anywhere, Eleanor." Around 2 a.m., Thomas sadly stopped being able to actually feel his hands or feet. His core body temperature had dropped to a dangerously low level. He knew deep down, in the rational part of his dwindling brain that could still somehow think clearly, that he was actively dying. But Eleanor was still alive, still breathing, still relatively warm against his own failing body. That was all that mattered to him. That simply had to be enough. Thomas thought again about his beloved mother, about her warm smile and her infectious laugh, and the way she used to lovingly tuck him safely into bed at night, no matter how tired she was. He thought again about what she'd constantly said about always staying kind, even when the cruel world wasn't kind back to you. "I kept my solemn promise to you, Mom," Thomas whispered softly into the cold darkness. "I bravely stayed kind, right to the very end." Eleanor stirred slightly against him. "Who are you talking to?" she asked groggily. "My mother," Thomas said simply. "Telling her that I love her very much. Then tell my mother that I love her too." "Please," Eleanor said dreamily. "And my dear Richard, and my beloved William. Tell them all that I love them all very much." "I will," Thomas promised her sincerely, even though he was now pretty sure that they were both tragically going to die out here, frozen and alone on the unforgiving steps of this cold mansion. Two lost souls who had somehow managed to find each other, briefly, at the very end of their lives. The heavy snow started falling again around 3 a.m. Big, heavy flakes that quickly accumulated, covering them both in a thick layer of pure white, like a surreal and frozen blanket. Thomas's rapidly fading consciousness flickered in and out. One moment he was acutely aware of the biting cold, and Eleanor's frail weight leaning against him. The next moment he was somehow somewhere warm and safe, and his beloved mother was there, smiling warmly at him, telling him that everything would be okay, that he was a good boy. "Just a little longer, Thomas," he desperately told himself when he briefly came back to full awareness. "Just hold on a little longer now." But he truly didn't know if Eleanor's son was even coming back. He honestly didn't know if anyone would ever find them out here. He didn't know if he would ever wake up again, or if the next time he closed his tired eyes would sadly be the very last time. All he truly knew for sure was that he wasn't going to let go of her. He wasn't going to leave Eleanor alone, and he wasn't going to break his sacred promise to always stay kind, no matter what. At precisely 5:47 a.m., bright headlights suddenly swept across the snow-covered steps. Thomas tried desperately to open his frozen eyes, but they felt completely frozen shut. He heard a car door slam shut loudly, heard hurried footsteps rapidly running toward them, heard someone screaming in anguish, "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" Thomas somehow forced his eyes open, just barely. A tall man was running frantically toward them, wearing an expensive coat, his face twisted with a mixture of horror and fear. Eleanor. This must be Eleanor's son, William, he realized dimly. Thomas tried desperately to speak, tried weakly to explain the desperate situation, but his voice simply wouldn't work anymore. He somehow gathered every last bit of strength he had left in his failing body and pushed the words out, one agonizing syllable at a time. She was lost. Thomas whispered weakly. I couldn't leave her. And then, gratefully, everything went completely dark. Thomas woke up to warmth, real, deep, penetrating warmth that strangely hurt almost as much as the brutal cold had. He was lying in a comfortable bed with heavy blankets piled high on top of him, and 4-bag dripped slowly into his arm, replenishing his fluids. Monitors beeped steadily and rhythmically beside him. Hospital, he realized slowly. A kind nurse appeared in his blurry field of vision, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and caring hands. Welcome back, she said softly, her voice full of genuine warmth. You certainly gave us quite a scare, young man. Eleanor. Thomas croaked weakly, his throat raw and incredibly sore. Is she? Mrs. Hartwell is fine, the nurse said, smiling reassuringly. Mild hypothermia, but she's definitely going to be perfectly okay. Thanks entirely to you. Her kind eyes filled with warm tears. You truly saved her life, sweetheart. You almost died bravely doing it, but you absolutely saved her precious life. Your own body heat kept her core temperature just barely above fatal levels. It's truly a miracle of timing. Thomas felt something release deep inside his chest, a wave of overwhelming relief washing over him. She was alive. Eleanor was still alive. That was truly all that really mattered to him. How long? Thomas asked weakly. You've been here with us for about 3 hours now, the nurse replied gently. Your core body temperature was down to a dangerously low 92 degrees when you came in. Another hour ticked by, and she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The door swung open and a man entered. The same man from the steps, Eleanor's son. Up close, William Hartwell looked younger than Thomas had initially thought, maybe late 40s, with dark hair and eyes red and puffy from crying. Behind him stood 2 police officers, a man and a woman, both in crisp uniforms. Thomas's stomach clenched into a knot. Here it came, the interrogation, the suspicion, the inherent assumption that he must have done something wrong, must be guilty of something. The woman stepped forward, her presence calm but authoritative. She was African American, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes that softened her otherwise official demeanor. I'm Detective Patricia Moore, she said, her voice gentle but firm. And this is Officer James Rodriguez. We just need to understand what happened, son. You're not in trouble. Thomas sat up slowly, wincing as a sharp ache shot through his ribs. He had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. I was walking yesterday evening, he began, his voice hoarse and raspy. I'd been evicted from my boarding house. I had nowhere to go. I was just trying to stay warm. Just after sunset, I heard someone crying. I found Mrs. Hartwell in an alley between houses, confused, barefoot, wearing only a thin nightgown. She was holding a picture frame, her wedding photo. William's breath caught in his throat, a visible wave of emotion washing over him. She said she needed to find her son William, that he was waiting for her at the train station. Thomas continued, his voice regaining strength as he recounted the events of the previous night. She didn't know where she lived, couldn't remember her address. She was freezing, so I gave her my jacket. I took her wedding picture and put it in my backpack so she wouldn't drop it, wouldn't lose it. You gave her your only jacket? William asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. His gaze fixed on the cracked picture frame now sitting on the bedside table. The one the hospital staff had carefully retrieved from Thomas's belongings. Thomas nodded, his expression earnest and sincere. Yes, sir. She needed it more than I did. We tried to find her home, but she couldn't remember which house it was. It was getting dark and colder. She was tired, disoriented. So I found a spot near your gate, out of the wind, and we sat down to rest. You sat there for 8 hours, William said, his voice barely above a whisper. You sat there for 8 hours in 15-degree weather. Yes, sir, Thomas replied, his gaze steady. I gave her my mother's blanket. It's all I had left of her. I just wanted to keep Mrs. Hartwell warm, keep her talking so she wouldn't fall asleep, wouldn't succumb to the cold. Detective Moore scribbled notes in her pad, her expression thoughtful. She never gave you her address? No, ma'am. She kept asking for her husband, talking about her son. But she couldn't remember home, couldn't recall where she lived. Why didn't you call for help? Officer Carter asked, his tone curious but not accusatory. Thomas hesitated, a flicker of pain crossing his face. The answer lived deep inside him, buried under years of watching how the world really worked, of experiencing its harsh realities firsthand. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. Because I've seen what happens when people like me try to help. William frowned slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? Thomas's eyes drifted to the window, his gaze unfocused. The falling snow outside blurred into a haunting memory, a painful reminder of past injustice. He was 16 again, standing under a flickering street light on the south side, the cold seeping into his bones. A man had collapsed on the sidewalk, drunk maybe, or injured, or both. Thomas had rushed to his side, shaking his shoulder, calling for help, desperate to assist. By the time the police arrived, people were already pointing at him, shouting accusations, claiming he tried to rob the man. They saw a skinny black kid kneeling over a white man's wallet on the ground, and in their eyes that was enough. I tried to help, Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with a deep-seated sadness. They handcuffed me, didn't listen to a word I said. It took the man waking up and saying I didn't touch him before they finally let me go. He looked back at them now, his gaze direct and unwavering. So when I found her, Mrs. Hartwell, I thought if I called, they'd see me with an old white lady in her nightgown and think the same thing. I didn't want to make things worse for her or for me. His voice cracked with emotion, his vulnerability laid bare. I just wanted to keep her safe. Detective Moore's pen stilled, her gaze softening. William's face crumpled, his jaw trembling as he whispered. His voice choked with emotion. My God. William turned away, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sir, Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with apprehension. Did I do something wrong? I swear I was only trying to help. William turned back, his eyes red and swollen, brimming with tears. No, Thomas, you did everything right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Everything I failed to do. He moved closer to the bed, his gaze intense and filled with gratitude. I watched the security footage, every single minute of it. I saw you give her your jacket, your blanket. I saw you wrap your arms around her to keep her warm, to shield her from the elements. You were willing to risk your own life to save my mother. I couldn't leave her, Thomas said simply, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. She needed someone. William's voice broke, his composure shattered. My mother has Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed years ago, but the symptoms have gotten dramatically worse over the last 3 years. I hired people, built systems, implemented safeguards, everything except being here, being present in her life. And while I was away on business, she walked out in the middle of the night. She wandered off in the freezing cold. The staff were asleep. The pedestrian gate security lock malfunctioned. I'd been meaning to get it fixed for weeks, but I kept putting it off. She could have died, Thomas. He took a shaky breath, struggling to regain his composure. But she didn't because you were there, because you stepped in when no one else did. Thomas looked down, unable to meet William's gaze, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. Detective Moore closed her notebook, her expression thoughtful and appreciative. Mr. Hartwell, the report will clearly show he saved her life. We'll file it that way without hesitation. She gave Thomas a small, respectful nod, acknowledging his heroism and compassion. You did a good thing, son, a truly remarkable thing. Then she and Officer Carter quietly stepped out of the room, leaving the two men alone in the hushed stillness of the hospital room. William remained silent for a long moment, staring out the hospital window at the snow still falling softly, blanketing the city in a pristine white. Then he turned back to Thomas, his gaze earnest and filled with gratitude. Do you have somewhere to go when they release you? Thomas shook his head, his expression resigned. No, sir. I'll figure something out. You'll come stay with us, William said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Thomas blinked in surprise, taken aback by the unexpected offer. Sir, you saved my mother's life. You're not sleeping on the streets after that. I have a guest house behind the property. It's warm, safe, private. You can stay there until you get back on your feet, until you find a new place to live, a new path forward. I can't accept that, Thomas whispered, overwhelmed by the man's generosity. You don't even know me. William smiled sadly, a genuine warmth radiating from his eyes. I know enough. You gave everything you had for a stranger. You sacrificed your own well-being for someone in need. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are as a person. Thomas stared at him, unsure whether to cry or laugh, his emotions a tangled mess of gratitude, disbelief, and hope. Just for a few days, then for as long as you need, William said, his voice gentle but firm. Maybe longer if that's what you want. The snow kept falling outside the hospital window, soft and endless, covering the city in a quiet blanket of white, a symbol of new beginnings and second chances. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with unspoken emotions and a growing sense of connection. William stood beside the bed, his presence a comforting reassurance, and Thomas, weak, exhausted, still half frozen from the previous night's ordeal, felt something unfamiliar stir inside him, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of trust. When the nurses came to check his vitals, William was still there, his unwavering presence a testament to his gratitude and compassion. He didn't leave that night or the next, and the days that followed slowly turned into weeks, his recovery gradually transforming into something that felt remarkably like belonging, like finally finding a place to call home. Weeks later, Thomas was coming home, leaving the sterile environment of the hospital behind and embarking on a new chapter in his life. William's mansion looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, almost welcoming, its imposing facade softened by the warm glow of the afternoon sun. As they pulled through the gates in William's Mercedes, Thomas's gaze was drawn to the spot where he'd spent that terrible night, the alcove where he had wrapped his body around Eleanor to shield her from the cold, the steps where he had nearly succumbed to hypothermia. What's that? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered alcove. A reminder, William said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, of what matters, of what you taught us, of the true meaning of compassion and selflessness. They pulled into the circular driveway, the front door swung open, and a little girl came running out, her face beaming with excitement. Maybe 10 or 11 years old, with blonde hair and pigtails and bright blue eyes that sparkled with joy. Is this him? She asked excitedly, bouncing on her toes with anticipation. Is this Thomas, Lily? William said, his voice warm with love and affection. Let him get out of the car first. Thomas climbed out of the car, feeling awkward and out of place in his borrowed hospital clothes, self-conscious under the little girl's intense gaze. Lily stared up at him with open curiosity, her expression filled with admiration and gratitude. You saved Grandma Eleanor, Lily said, her voice filled with awe. You're a hero. I'm not a hero, Thomas said, uncomfortable with the label, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I just did what anyone would do. No, a voice said firmly from the doorway. Eleanor stood there leaning on a walker, her eyes clearer than they'd been that terrible night, her gaze filled with warmth and gratitude. You did what most people wouldn't do. That's exactly what makes you a hero. She shuffled forward slowly, her steps unsteady but determined, and Thomas met her halfway, taking her frail hand in his touch gentle and respectful. "Thank you," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her wrinkled face, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for staying with me, for not leaving me alone in the cold." "I couldn't leave you," Thomas said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. "You needed help." Eleanor patted his cheek with her free hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "You're a good boy, Thomas. Your mother raised you right." The mention of his mother made Thomas's throat tighten with emotion, a wave of grief washing over him. Inside, the mansion was overwhelming in its opulence, a stark contrast to the poverty and hardship he had known his entire life. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, priceless art on the walls that probably cost more than his mother had made in her entire life. Thomas felt like he was in a museum, not a home, a stranger in a strange land. "I know it's a lot," William said, noticing Thomas's overwhelmed expression. "We can make changes, make it feel more like a home and less like a showplace, a place where you can truly relax and be yourself." "That's something I've been meaning to do anyway." A woman appeared from one of the side rooms, her presence warm and welcoming. Patricia, the housekeeper Thomas had heard about, her reputation preceding her. Middle-aged, with kind eyes and a warm smile that instantly put him at ease. "You must be Thomas," she said, her voice gentle and kind. "Welcome home. I've prepared a room for you upstairs. Let me show you." Thomas followed her up a sweeping staircase, feeling like he was stepping into a dream. Lily trailed behind them, chattering about the house and her school and her beloved cat, Mr. Whiskers, her infectious enthusiasm filling the air. "This will be your room," Patricia said, opening a door and stepping aside. Thomas stepped inside and stopped, completely overwhelmed. The room was huge, bigger than the entire apartment he'd shared with his mother for all those years. A four-poster bed with a thick comforter that looked incredibly soft and inviting. A desk by the window overlooking the gardens. A bookshelf filled with an intriguing selection of books. A dresser. A door that led to a private bathroom. "It's too much," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's yours," Patricia said firmly, her smile unwavering. "All of it. Mr. Hartwell had me stock the closet with clothes in your size. The bathroom has everything you need. If there's anything else you want, anything at all, just let me know." After Patricia left, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, almost afraid to disturb it, afraid that he would somehow break the spell and wake up from this incredible dream. The mattress was soft and plush, conforming to his body as he sat down. The room smelled clean and fresh, a welcome change from the stale and musty odors of the boarding house he had been forced to call home. Everything was perfect, too perfect, almost surreal. Thomas pulled his backpack onto the bed, his only possession, his constant companion through the years of hardship and homelessness, and carefully took out his mother's photograph, the harmonica she'd given him for his 16th birthday, a cherished reminder of happier times, and the now empty plastic bag that had protected her blanket from the elements. He placed the photo and the harmonica on the nightstand, the only things in this perfect room that felt like they belonged to him, that grounded him in reality. A knock on the door made him turn, his heart skipping a beat. Lily poked her head in, her blonde pigtails bouncing. "Can I come in?" she asked, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. "It's your house," Thomas said, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's your house too now," Lily said, coming in and climbing onto the end of his bed, her presence filling the room with a youthful energy. "Daddy says you're going to live with us like forever, if that's okay with you," Thomas said, his voice filled with gratitude. "It's more than okay, Lily. It's more than I ever could have hoped for," Lily said, her expression earnest and sincere. "I always wanted a brother. All my friends have brothers or sisters, but it's just been me and Daddy and Grandma Eleanor. And Daddy's always working, and Grandma Eleanor gets confused a lot. And sometimes I get really lonely in this big house." She looked at Thomas hopefully, her blue eyes searching his. Do you think you'll like living here? Thomas thought about sleeping on park benches, about being cold and hungry and scared, about having nowhere to belong, no one to care for him. He thought about the kindness and generosity he had been shown in the past few days, the warmth and acceptance he had found in this unexpected place. Yeah, he said honestly, his voice filled with conviction. I think I will. Good. Lily said beaming, her face lighting up with joy. Want to meet Mr. Whiskers? That first night, they had dinner together in the formal dining room. A scene that felt both surreal and incredibly comforting. William sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding but warm. Eleanor sat at the foot, her expression serene and content. Lily sat on one side, chattering excitedly about her day, and Thomas sat across from her, feeling self-conscious and out of place, but also strangely at peace. Patricia served pot roast with vegetables, and the savory smell made Thomas's stomach growl so loudly that Lily giggled, her laughter infectious. Don't be shy, William said, passing him the serving dishes with a warm smile. Take as much as you want. Thomas filled his plate, trying not to take too much, trying to remember his table manners, conscious of every movement he made, every sound he emitted. He didn't belong here, he knew that, anyone could see that. But when he looked up, William was watching him with an expression that wasn't judgment or pity, but something else entirely, something akin to pride and genuine affection. Tell me about yourself, Thomas, William said, his voice gentle and encouraging. What do you like to do? What are you interested in? Thomas had been surviving for so long, focused solely on his next meal and his next safe place to sleep, that he couldn't remember what he liked, what he was passionate about. I used to like reading, he said slowly, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. Before, when I was in school, I liked history and English and I played harmonica a little. My mom gave me one for my 16th birthday, right before He couldn't finish the sentence, the grief still too raw. We have a library, Lily said excitedly, her eyes sparkling, a whole room full of books. You can read anything you want. And I'd like to hear you play harmonica sometime, William said, his expression encouraging. When you're ready. Eleanor, who had been eating quietly, suddenly looked up at Thomas with focused eyes, her gaze piercing and insightful. What was your mother's name? She asked. Sarah, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah Wheeler. Sarah. Eleanor repeated softly, her eyes softening. That's a beautiful name. She must have been a remarkable woman to raise such a kind and compassionate son. She was, Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. She really was. After dinner, Thomas excused himself and went back to his room, needing some time alone to process everything that had happened, to come to terms with his new reality. He sat on the edge of the soft bed and pulled out his harmonica, the one his mother had given him just weeks before she died, a tangible reminder of her love and sacrifice. He hadn't played it since her funeral, the pain too raw, the memories too vivid. But tonight, he brought it to his lips and played the song his mother had loved, the song that had always brought her comfort. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. When he finished, he found Lily standing in his doorway, tears streaming down her face, her expression filled with emotion. That was beautiful, she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. My mom used to sing that song, before she got sick. Thomas patted the bed beside him, and Lily came and sat down, her small frame trembling with grief. Tell me about her, Thomas said gently, offering her a comforting presence. So Lily told him about her mother, about her infectious laugh and her unwavering love of baking and the way she used to dance around the kitchen, her movements graceful and carefree, about how cancer had cruelly taken her when Lily was only 5, leaving a void in her life that could never be filled. I don't remember her as well as I want to, Lily said sadly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I'm scared I'm forgetting her face, forgetting her voice, forgetting all the precious memories we shared. You won't forget, Thomas said, his voice filled with conviction. Not the important stuff, not how she made you feel, not the love and joy she brought into your life. Do you still remember your mom? Lily asked, her blue eyes searching his. Every day, Thomas said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. Every single day, they sat together in comfortable silence, two kids who'd lost their mothers, who understood each other in a way most people couldn't, their shared grief creating a bond that transcended words. The first week was the hardest. Thomas kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the dream to end, for William to change his mind, for someone to realize that this was all a mistake, that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't worthy of this incredible opportunity. He barely touched anything in his room, afraid of making a mess, afraid of overstepping his boundaries. He made his bed every morning with military precision, folding the comforter with meticulous care, smoothing out every wrinkle. He ate sparingly at meals, afraid of taking too much, afraid of being a burden. He moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying not to disturb anything, trying not to leave a mark, his presence barely noticeable. On the fifth day, William found him in the library, sitting at a table and reading a history book, but afraid to take it off the shelf, afraid of damaging it. "Thomas," William said, sitting down across from him, his expression serious. "We need to talk." Thomas's heart sank, a wave of dread washing over him. Here it came, the dismissal, the inevitable realization that this had all been a mistake, that he was nothing more than a charity case. "This isn't working," William continued, his voice gentle but firm. Thomas nodded, fighting back tears, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand. I can be packed in 5 minutes. I won't—" "What?" William interrupted, confused. "No, that's not what I meant at all." He ran his hand through his hair, his brow furrowing in frustration. "I mean, you being afraid to live here isn't working. You're tiptoeing around like you're a guest, like you're going to be kicked out at any moment, like you don't belong here. I don't want to be a burden," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You're not a burden," William said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Your family, Thomas. This is your home, and I need you to start acting like it." He stood up and began pulling books off the shelf, stacking them on the table with a resounding thud. "Take these to your room. Read them, devour them. Dog-ear the pages if you want. Spill coffee on them, highlight passages that resonate with you. They're just books, Thomas. They're meant to be used, not worshipped, not preserved for posterity." He gestured around the library, his gaze encompassing the entire room. "Everything in this house is meant to be used, not preserved, not worshipped, used, lived in, enjoyed." William sat back down, his expression softening, his eyes filled with compassion. "I've been thinking about what you said in court, about wanting to stop surviving and start living. That's what I want for you, too, Thomas. But you can't do that if you're constantly afraid I'm going to send you away, if you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop." "How do I know you won't?" Thomas asked, voicing his deepest fear, his vulnerability laid bare. "Because I'm starting the guardianship paperwork tomorrow," William said, his voice filled with conviction. "Because I'm enrolling you in school, giving you the opportunity to finish your education and pursue your dreams. Because I'm putting your name on a bank account, giving you a sense of financial security and independence. I've already hired a lawyer to help recover your birth certificate and get you proper documentation, because I'm making you legally, officially, permanently part of this family." He leaned forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Thomas, I'm not your foster parent. I'm not someone who took you in for money or because it looked good, because it made me look like a good person. I'm someone who wants you here, who needs you here. You saved my mother's life. You reminded me what truly matters in this world. You showed my daughter what real courage looks like." William's voice cracked with emotion, his eyes glistening with tears. "You gave me my family back, Thomas. Let me give you one in return." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, his emotions overwhelming him. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice filled with self-doubt. "I don't know how to be part of a family anymore." "Then we'll figure it out together," William said, his voice filled with unwavering support. "All of us will make mistakes, we'll have rough days, but we'll do it together. That's what family means, Thomas, supporting each other through thick and thin, celebrating each other's triumphs, and helping each other through the difficult times." After that conversation, things started to shift, slowly but surely. Thomas began taking books to his room, devouring them with a newfound passion, immersing himself in stories and knowledge. He started eating normal portions at meals, savoring the delicious food and enjoying the company of his new family. He laughed at Lily's jokes, appreciating her infectious enthusiasm and her genuine affection. He helped Eleanor on her bad days, reading to her, sitting with her, keeping her company and providing a comforting presence. And slowly, gradually, the mansion started to feel less like a museum and more like a home, a place where he truly belonged, a place where he could finally be himself. 2 weeks after moving in, William sat Thomas down with a stack of papers, his expression serious but encouraging. "I've been doing some research," William said. "You're 19, but you never finished high school, and I know that's something you regret. I'd like to get you a tutor to help you study for your GED. Once you pass that, you can enroll in community college. Maybe eventually transfer to a 4-year university, if that's what you want, if that's the path you choose to take." Thomas stared at the papers, his eyes wide with disbelief. GED study guides, college brochures, information about financial aid, all laid out before him, a tangible representation of William's unwavering support and belief in him. "You're serious?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About school?" "Completely serious," William said, his expression resolute. "Your mother wanted you to finish your education, Thomas, and I know that's something you've always wanted, too. Let's make that happen. Let's turn your dreams into reality." "I don't know if I'm smart enough anymore," Thomas admitted, his voice filled with self-doubt. "It's been 3 years since I was in a classroom, and I feel like I've forgotten so much." "Then you'll relearn it," William said simply, his confidence unwavering. "You're one of the smartest people I've ever met, Thomas. You survived 3 years on the streets, you figured out how to stay alive in impossible conditions, you navigated a world filled with hardship and injustice. If you can do that, you can pass a test, you can conquer any challenge you set your mind to." The tutor arrived the next week, a retired teacher named Mr. Rodriguez, a kind and patient man with a gentle demeanor and an unwavering belief in the power of education. Maybe 65 years old, with kind eyes and a warm smile that instantly put Thomas at ease. "Let's see where you are," Mr. Rodriguez said during their first session, handing Thomas a practice test. Thomas struggled through it, feeling stupid and inadequate with every question he couldn't answer, every concept he couldn't grasp. When Mr. Rodriguez scored it, Thomas had barely passed 2 of the 4 sections, his heart sinking with disappointment and self-doubt. "It's okay," Mr. Rodriguez said, seeing Thomas's devastation, his voice reassuring and encouraging. "This is just the starting point, just a baseline. We've got time, Thomas, plenty of time to work hard and improve." So they worked diligently and tirelessly, every morning at 6 a.m. Before William left for work and Lily left for school, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his books, poring over the material, determined to succeed. Math problems that made his head hurt, science concepts he'd never learned, history he'd forgotten, reading comprehension that seemed impossible to master. Some days he wanted to quit, to give up, to admit defeat. Wanted to say it was too hard, too much, too late. On one of those days, Eleanor found him in the library, surrounded by failed practice tests. His head in his hands, his spirit crushed. She was having a good day, one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity, her mind sharp and focused. "You look troubled, young man," she said, sitting down beside him with some effort, her presence a comforting reassurance. "I'm not smart enough," Thomas said, his voice filled with despair. "I'm going to fail this test and disappoint everyone, especially William." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand in her frail, spotted one, her touch surprisingly firm. "My husband, William's father, used to say something I've never forgotten," Eleanor said, her voice filled with wisdom. "He said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway, about facing your fears head-on, even when you're shaking with anxiety." She squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. "You've been courageous your whole life, Thomas. Surviving what you survived, staying kind when the world was cruel, saving an old woman you didn't even know, risking your own life for a stranger in need. This This is just one more thing you'll be brave enough to face. Just another challenge you'll overcome. What if I fail? Thomas whispered, his voice filled with apprehension. Then you try again, Eleanor said simply, her voice filled with unwavering faith. Failure isn't falling down, Thomas. Failure is staying down, giving up, refusing to get back on your feet. And you, my dear boy, have never stayed down in your life. You've always found a way to rise above the challenges. Her eyes started to cloud again, drifting back to confusion. But her words stayed with Thomas, resonating in his heart and giving him the strength to persevere. The GED test was scheduled for a Monday in late April, a date that loomed large on the horizon. Thomas woke up that morning sick with nerves, his stomach churning with anxiety. He couldn't eat breakfast, the thought of food making him nauseous. His hands shook uncontrollably as he got dressed, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. William drove him to the testing center, his presence a comforting reassurance. Before Thomas got out of the car, William put a hand on his shoulder, his gaze earnest and sincere. Whatever happens today, Thomas, I'm proud of you, he said, his voice filled with genuine affection. You've worked harder than anyone I know, you've dedicated yourself to this goal, and that's success in itself, regardless of what some test says. The test took 4.5 hours, an eternity of mental exertion and agonizing self-doubt. Math, science, language arts, social studies, a barrage of questions that tested his knowledge and his resolve. Some questions Thomas knew immediately, strategies Mr. Rodriguez had drilled into him, clicking into place with satisfying clarity. Others he had to work through carefully, applying his knowledge and reasoning skills to arrive at the correct answer. Some he guessed on, hoping for the best, trusting his instincts and his gut feeling. When it was over, Thomas felt numb, hollow, emotionally and physically drained. He had no idea if he'd passed or failed, if he'd succeeded or fallen short. Results would come in 6 weeks, an agonizing wait that stretched out before him like an endless desert. 6 weeks of waiting, 6 weeks of uncertainty, 6 weeks of waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, convinced he'd failed, replaying the test questions in his mind and agonizing over his mistakes. 6 weeks of trying not to think about what failure would mean, about the disappointment and the setbacks, about the possibility of never achieving his dream. But during those 6 weeks, something else was happening, something Thomas didn't fully recognize, a subtle shift in the dynamics of the household, a deepening of the bonds that connected them all. At first, it was just small things, almost imperceptible. William started coming home earlier, making an effort to have dinner with them every night, prioritizing family time over his demanding work schedule. Instead of working until 9 o'clock or 10 p.m., he played board games with Lily, his laughter filling the house with joy. He sat with Eleanor, talking to her about memories, about his father, about the past, patiently listening to her stories and providing a comforting presence. One evening, William found Thomas in the library, sitting at a table and reading, his brow furrowed in concentration. William sat down beside him with a heavy sigh, his expression thoughtful. I hired a new CEO, William said. Someone I trust to handle the day-to-day operations of the company. Someone who shares my vision and values. Why? Thomas asked, surprised by the unexpected announcement. Because I realized something, William said, his voice filled with newfound wisdom. That night when you gave everything you had to save my mother, you showed me what I'd lost, what I'd forgotten in my relentless pursuit of success. I'd been so busy building an empire that I forgot to build a life. I'd been so focused on financial gain that I forgot what success actually means, what truly matters in this world. He looked at Thomas, his gaze earnest and sincere. It means having people you love, being there for them, supporting them, cherishing them, not just providing for them financially, but actually being present in their lives, sharing their joys and sorrows, celebrating their triumphs and helping them through the difficult times. You reminded me of that, Thomas. You gave me my family back. You gave me a reason to slow down and appreciate the simple things in life. I didn't do anything special, Thomas protested, uncomfortable with the praise. That's exactly what made it special, William said, his voice filled with admiration. To you, it wasn't even a question, it wasn't a calculated act of heroism. It was just the right thing to do. Someone needed help, and you helped, simple as that. But it's not simple, Thomas, William said, his voice filled with emotion. Most people walk away, most people protect themselves first, most people are too afraid to get involved. You didn't. And that changed everything. It changed my life, it changed my family. It changed the course of our future. On a Thursday in early May, the envelope came, a plain white rectangle that held the key to his future. Thomas stood in the kitchen staring at it, his heart pounding in his chest. The return address was the State Department of Education, the sender's identity confirming the envelope's significance. Inside was either his GED certificate, a tangible symbol of his hard work and perseverance, or a failure notice, a devastating confirmation that he'd have to try again, that he wasn't good enough. His hands shook so badly that he couldn't open it, the anticipation and anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. Lily appeared at his elbow, her presence a comforting reassurance. "Want me to do it?" she asked, her blue eyes filled with concern. "No," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to face this, whatever the outcome. He took a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "I'm really scared." "I know," Lily said, her voice gentle and supportive. "But remember what you told Grandma, Elainer, that night, promising everything would be all right." "You promised," Thomas said, a nervous smile playing on his lips, echoing my own words back to me. "Yep," Lily chimed in, grinning wide. With trembling hands, Thomas ripped open the envelope. He'd passed. Not just passed, but scored in the 93rd percentile overall, 97% in reading, 94 in social studies, 89 in science, 88 in math. He whispered, staring at the certificate bearing his name. "Thomas Wheeler, I actually did it." Lily leaped up and down, screaming, "You did it! You did it! You did it!" William came running from his office, asking, "What happened? What's wrong?" Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he said, "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. I passed. I'm going to college." William enveloped him in a tight hug. Thomas realized it was the first time a father figure had hugged him since his own father had left before he was even born. William's voice, thick with emotion, said, "I never doubted you. Not for 1 second." That night they threw a celebration. Patricia cooked pot roast, Thomas's all-time favorite. Elainer, under one of her rare clear evenings, raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To Thomas," she declared, her voice ringing with strength and pride, "who reminds us all what it means to be brave, what it means to be kind, what it means to be human." "To Thomas," everyone echoed, looking around the table at these people who had become his family. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 4 long years. Not just hope, not just safety, but pure, unadulterated joy. Summer semester at the community college started in June, and without a moment's hesitation, Thomas chose social work as his major. He wanted to help kids just like him. Kids who had fallen through the cracks, kids who needed someone to see them. His first class was an introduction to social services, taught by Dr. Sarah Reed, a professor known for being tough, demanding, and impossible to fool. After the 3rd class, she asked Thomas to stay behind. "I read your admissions essay," she said, "about being homeless, about saving Elainer Hartwell." Thomas tensed, bracing himself for judgment or pity. "I was homeless, too," Dr. Reed revealed. "When I was 18, got kicked out when I came out as gay. Lived in my car for almost a year." She smiled, and Thomas saw understanding in her eyes. "Someone helped me. A librarian who saw me sleeping in my car in the library parking lot and refused to look away. She helped me find housing, helped me apply for college, helped me build a life." Dr. Reed leaned forward. "You have a gift, Thomas, the ability to see pain in others because you've felt it yourself. That empathy, born from lived experience, is what makes truly great social workers." "I want to help people," Thomas said, his voice filled with conviction. "Kids especially. I want to be the person who doesn't walk away." "Then you're in exactly the right place," Dr. Reed replied. Thomas threw himself into his studies with an intensity that even surprised himself. He was always the first one in class, the last one to leave. He read every assignment twice, participated in every discussion, volunteered for every project. His classmates noticed. "How do you stay so focused?" asked Maya, a girl who sat next to him in social problems class. "Don't you ever just want to, I don't know, take a break? Have fun?" Thomas thought about those cold nights on park benches, about the gnawing hunger that made his stomach cramp, about the fear that never quite went away even now. "I remember what it cost to get here," Thomas said simply. "I'm not wasting this chance." At home, life settled into a rhythm that felt more and more like normal. Thomas helped Lily with her homework every evening. He sat with Ella Laner on her bad days when she didn't recognize anyone, reading to her from her favorite books, mostly Jane Austen and poetry. He had real conversations with William about philosophy and ethics, about what it means to live a good life. One evening in September, almost a year after that terrible night, William came home with news. "I'm starting a foundation," he announced over dinner. "The Ella Laner Hartwell Foundation for Homeless Youth. It'll provide housing, education, support, job training, and mental health services for young people aging out of foster care or living on the streets." He looked at Thomas. "I want you to be involved. Your perspective, your lived experience, it's invaluable. Would you consider joining the advisory board?" Thomas felt overwhelmed. "I'm just a college student. I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know the most important thing," William said. "You know what it's like. You understand it in a way I never could. No matter how much research I do, that's exactly what we need." So Thomas joined the board. At 20 years old, by far the youngest member, he sat in meetings with business people, philanthropists, and nonprofit directors and told them hard truths. "It's not enough to give people a bed for the night," Thomas said at one board meeting. "They need dignity. They need to be seen as people, not problems. They need structure, yes, but also freedom. They need support, but also the space to make their own choices. And most of all, they need someone to believe in them when they've stopped believing in themselves." The foundation launched in January with a pilot shelter specifically for young adults ages 18 to 24. They provided not just housing, but wraparound services, education support, job training, mental health counseling, life skills classes, and, most importantly, staff who genuinely cared. Thomas volunteered there 3 times a week. Even with his full college schedule, he couldn't stay away. These were his people. One cold February evening, Thomas was working the dinner shift when a kid came in. Maybe 17, thin and weary, wearing clothes too light for winter, with eyes that had seen too much. The kid reminded Thomas so much of himself. "First time here?" Thomas asked gently. The kid nodded, not meeting his eyes, his shoulders hunched defensively. "I'm Thomas. Want some food? We've got chicken and rice tonight. Real food, not shelter slop." The kid's stomach growled audibly, betraying his hunger. "Yeah, okay." Thomas got him a tray piled high with food, chicken, rice, vegetables, salad, bread, and apple pie. The kid stared at it like it might disappear. "It's yours," Thomas said. "All of it. Take your time." As the kid ate like he was starving, which he probably was, Thomas sat down across from him. "I was homeless too," Thomas said quietly. "For almost 3 years. I know how hard it is, how scary, how exhausting, how every single day is just about surviving until tomorrow." The kid looked up, searching Thomas's face. Finding no pity, no judgment, just understanding, he relaxed slightly. "How'd you get out?" the kid asked. So Thomas told him. Not the sanitized version that appeared in the news articles, not the feel-good story that made donors open their wallets, but the real version with the fear, the cold, the hunger, the choice to help an old woman even when it cost him everything. "The thing is," Thomas said, "I didn't know that night would change my life. I just knew someone needed help, and I was there. Sometimes that's all it takes. Being there, being willing, being kind, even when it's hard." The kid was quiet, absorbing this. "Can I stay here tonight?" he finally asked. "In the shelter?" "Absolutely," Thomas said. And tomorrow, if you want, we can talk about next steps, school, job training, whatever you need. He paused. You don't have to do this alone anymore. The kid's eyes filled with tears. I've been alone for so long. I know, Thomas said, his throat tight with remembered pain. I know exactly how that feels, but not anymore. We've got you now. Ella Laner's Alzheimer's progressed steadily through Thomas's second year of college. The clear days became fewer and farther between. The confusion became deeper. The woman who had been so sharp, so present, slowly faded into a fog that never quite lifted. But Thomas sat with her anyway. Every evening when he got home from class or the shelter, he'd find Ella Laner in her room or in her chair by the library window, and he'd sit with her. Sometimes he read to her, sometimes he just held her hand. Sometimes she thought he was William's father, Richard. Sometimes she thought he was her own son as a young man. Sometimes she didn't know who he was at all. It didn't matter. Thomas stayed anyway. You're a good boy, Ella Laner would say on her clearer moments, patting his hand. Your mother raised you right. Thank you, Gran, Thomas would say, and mean it. He'd started calling her Gran naturally, without thinking about it. She was his grandmother now in every way that mattered. One evening in July, as Thomas sat reading to her from Pride and Prejudice, her favorite, Ella Laner suddenly gripped his hand with surprising strength. Thomas, she said, her voice clearer than it had been in weeks. I need to tell you something. I'm here, Gran, Thomas said, putting down the book. That night, Ella Laner said. The night you found me, I wasn't really lost. Thomas frowned, confused. What do you mean? I mean, part of me knew I was outside. Part of me knew it was cold. Part of me knew I should go back inside. Her eyes focused on him with startling clarity. But I was so tired, Thomas. So tired of being confused. So tired of not recognizing my own son. So tired of losing myself piece by piece. Thomas felt his heart break. I thought maybe if I just stayed out there, Ella Laner continued, it would end peacefully in the cold, just falling asleep and not waking up. Gran, Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. But then you came, Ella Laner said, squeezing his hand. This young man who had nothing, who was suffering himself, and you didn't walk away. You stayed. You kept me warm. You kept me alive. She smiled. You reminded me that life is worth living. Even when it's hard, even when you're losing yourself, because there are still people worth living for. She touched his face gently. You saved me in more ways than you know, Thomas. And I want you to know something. I may not always remember your name. I may not always know who you are, but somewhere deep inside, where the disease can't reach, I know you, and I love you like you're my own grandson. I love you too, Gran, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Ella Laner's eyes started to cloud again, the moment of clarity fading. Is it time for tea? She asked, confused again. Yes, Thomas said, wiping his eyes. It's time for tea. 3 weeks later, on a quiet August morning, Ella Laner passed away in her sleep. William found her at dawn, lying peacefully in her bed, her hands folded over her chest, a small smile on her face. She looked at rest, finally at peace. The funeral was huge, with hundreds of people whose lives Ella Laner had touched over her 78 years. But the moment Thomas would always remember was standing at the graveside, Lily on one side of him and William on the other, saying goodbye to the woman who had given him a family. The headstone was simple. Ella Laner Margaret Hartwell, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. And below that, a line William had chosen. She taught us that home is where someone waits for you. After the service, after everyone else had left, Thomas stayed. He knelt by the fresh grave and pulled out his harmonica. He played Amazing Grace, the song his mother had loved, the song Ella Laner had loved, too. He played it for both of them, these two women who'd shaped him, who'd loved him, who taught him what it meant to be human. When he finished, Lily was standing behind him, tears streaming down her face. That was beautiful, she whispered. She deserved beautiful, Thomas said. That fall, Thomas started his third year of college. The Ella Laner Hartwell Foundation opened 2 more shelters and expanded their services. They'd helped over 200 young people in their first year of operation. William threw himself into the foundation work with an intensity that Thomas recognized. Grief channeled into purpose. They worked side by side, William handling the business and fundraising aspects, Thomas providing insight and direct service. One evening in November, almost 2 years after that terrible night, Thomas and William were in William's office reviewing grant applications. "Look at this one," William said, handing Thomas a file. "Kid aged out of foster care at 18. Been living in his car for 6 months. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" Thomas read the application. The story was heartbreakingly similar to his own. "Let's bring him in," Thomas said. "Get him into housing, into our GED program, help him figure out next steps." "Done," William said, making a note. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. And then William said something that had clearly been on his mind. "You know what haunts me?" William asked. Thomas looked up. "That I almost lost everything," William continued. "My mother could have died that night, and it would have been my fault because I was too busy, too focused on work, too sure that money and staff could replace actually being present." He looked at Thomas. "You gave me a second chance. A chance to be the son my mother deserved, to be the father Lily deserves, to be the person I should have been all along." "You're a good father," Thomas said. "A good person." "I'm trying to be," William said. "Because of you. Because you showed me what it looks like to give everything you have for someone else, to sacrifice without expecting anything in return." He smiled. "You know what my mother said to me a few days before she died? During one of her clear moments?" Thomas shook his head. She said, "Thomas didn't just save my life, William. He saved all of us. He reminded us what love looks like." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "She was right," William said. "You did save us, all of us." By his 4th year of college, Thomas had become something of a campus figure. Not famous exactly, but known as the guy who'd been homeless, the guy who'd saved the old woman, the guy who actually cared. Students sought him out, told him their problems, asked for advice. And Thomas, who'd once been invisible, who'd once been nothing, listened, really listened, and helped when he could. He started a support group for students who'd experienced homelessness or foster care. A safe space to talk about trauma, to share resources, to remind each other they weren't alone. The group met every Wednesday evening in the student union. Sometimes 5 people came, sometimes 20, but they always came. These students who'd survived impossible things, drawn together by shared experience and Thomas's quiet leadership. "I don't know how you do it," Maya said one day after a particularly emotional group session. "How you hold all that pain and keep going." Thomas thought about that, about his mother's words, about Elainer's example, about every person who'd helped him along the way. "I don't hold it," Thomas said. "I carry it. There's a difference. Holding means keeping it to yourself, letting it weigh you down. Carrying means using it to understand others, to help them with their own burdens." He smiled. "My mom used to say that pain doesn't have to be wasted, can be transformed into compassion, into action, into change." In the spring of his 4th year, Thomas was invited to speak at a conference on homelessness in Washington, D.C. He almost said no. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of people, of sharing his story on such a big stage, terrified him. But William convinced him. "Your story matters," William said. "Your voice matters. These people need to hear from someone who's lived it, not just studied it." So Thomas went. The conference was huge. Policymakers, nonprofit directors, researchers, advocates, all gathered to discuss solutions to homelessness. Thomas sat through panels and presentations, listening to people talk about the homeless population like they were statistics, not human beings. When it was his turn to speak, Thomas walked to the podium with shaking hands. He looked out at the sea of faces. Mostly older, mostly white, mostly people who'd never missed a meal or slept on a park bench in their lives, and he told them the truth. "I was 19 years old," Thomas began, "and I had $17 to my name. I'd been homeless for almost 3 years, and I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like. But that December night, when I found Mrs. Elainer Hartwell, lost and confused in the freezing cold, I learned something important." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I learned that rock bottom isn't about how little you have. It's about how alone you feel. It's about believing that no one sees you, no one cares, no one would even notice if you disappeared. Thomas looked out at the audience. Eleanor Hartwell came from wealth and privilege. I came from poverty and homelessness. We couldn't have been more different. But that night we were the same. Two people who needed help, two people who needed to be seen. He told them about the cold, about the decision to stay, about wrapping Eleanor in his mother's blanket, about fighting to survive until morning. People always ask me why I didn't just call 911 and walk away, Thomas said. Why I risked my own life. And the answer is simple, because she needed someone to stay, and I was there. His voice grew stronger. But here's what I want you to understand. That night changed my life. It gave me a family, a home, opportunities one never could have imagined. But most homeless people don't get that kind of ending. Most of them die alone or they survive, but they stay trapped in cycles of poverty and trauma. Thomas leaned forward, his hands gripping the podium. The systems we have now, they're built on the assumption that homeless people are broken and need to be fixed, that they're lazy or addicted or mentally ill. And sure, some struggle with those things. But you know what? Every single homeless person I've ever met struggles with being invisible, being treated like they're less than human, being told in 1,000 subtle ways that they don't matter. He looked directly at the policymakers in the front row. You want to solve homelessness? Then stop designing programs that treat people like problems to be managed. Start designing programs that treat them like human beings who deserve dignity, who deserve to be seen, who deserve someone who won't walk away. The speech went viral. Thomas's face appeared on news websites and social media. He got interview requests from major networks. The foundation's phone lines lit up with donors wanting to help. But the message that meant the most came from someone unexpected. It was an email from Mrs. Rodriguez, Thomas's fourth-grade teacher, the one he barely remembered. Dear Thomas, she wrote, I saw your speech in Washington. I wanted you to know that I remember you. I remember a bright, kind boy who shared his lunch with classmates who forgot theirs, who helped other students with their homework even when he was struggling himself, who always had a smile. Even though I knew things were hard at home with your mother being so sick. I lost track of you after elementary school, but I never forgot you. And I'm not surprised you grew into this remarkable young man. That kindness was always in you, Thomas. Your mother planted it deep. The world tried to take it, but you held on. That's the real miracle, not that you survived, but that you stayed kind. Thomas read the email 3 times, crying, and then forwarded it to William with a simple message. This is why we do the work. Thomas graduated in May with his bachelor's degree in social work. He was 23 years old, and he'd come further than he'd ever dreamed possible. William, Lily, and half the staff from the foundation came to the ceremony. When Thomas's name was called, they all stood and cheered so loudly that other families turned to look. Thomas walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, and looked out at the people who'd become his family. William beaming with pride, Lily, now 15 years old, jumping up and down and waving, Patricia dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and Mr. Rodriguez, his tutor, grinning from the crowd. In that moment, Thomas thought about his mother, about Eleanor, about every person who'd helped him get here. I did it, he thought. We did it. After graduation, Thomas was offered jobs at 3 different nonprofits in 3 different cities. Good positions with good salaries, opportunities to build a career. He turned them all down. Why? William asked when Thomas told him. These are excellent opportunities, especially the one in New York. Because the work is here, Thomas said simply. The foundation is here. The kids who need help are here. This is where I belong. So Thomas accepted a position as Director of Youth Services at the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation. It wasn't the highest-paying offer he'd received, but it was the right one. He worked with kids who'd aged out of foster care, with teenagers living on the streets, with young adults trying to rebuild their lives after trauma and loss. And with each one, Thomas brought his own experience, his own understanding, his own refusal to give up on them. One afternoon in September, for years after that terrible December night, Thomas was in his office when he got a call from the front desk. Thomas, "There's someone here asking for you," says his name is Marcus. Thomas went down to the lobby and found a young black man, maybe 17, standing nervously by the door. He was thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days, holding a backpack that looked like it contained everything he owned. "Marcus," Thomas said. "I'm Thomas. How can I help you?" "I saw you speak," Marcus said, "on YouTube, the speech in Washington, and I thought maybe—" He trailed off, looking uncertain. "Come on," Thomas said gently. "Let's go talk in my office." They walked upstairs together, and Thomas remembered being in Marcus's position. Scared, alone, desperately hoping someone would see him. In his office, Marcus told his story. Aged out of foster care 6 months ago, been living in his car until it broke down, lost his job when he couldn't shower regularly, running out of options, running out of hope. "I know you probably can't help," Marcus said. "I know I'm just one more kid with the same story everyone has. But I saw your speech, and you talked about being seen, about matching, and I just—" His voice broke. "I just need someone to see me." Thomas felt his eyes fill with tears. This could have been him. This was him 4 years ago. "I see you, Marcus," Thomas said firmly. "And we're going to help. That's what we do here." Over the next few months, Thomas worked with Marcus personally. Got him into one of the Foundation's housing units, helped him enroll in the GED program, connected him with a therapist to work through his trauma, found him a job at a local restaurant that was willing to work. It wasn't easy balancing his school schedule. Marcus had days where the trauma felt like too much, days he wanted to quit, to run away, to just give up. But Thomas was always there, a constant presence, refusing to abandon him. "Why do you care so much?" Marcus asked him one day after a particularly difficult therapy session. "Because someone cared about me," Thomas said simply, and that made all the difference in the world. By December, Marcus had successfully passed his GED exam. By spring, he was officially enrolled in community college. And by the following fall, he was truly thriving. He was working a part-time job, attending classes, and even volunteering at the Foundation, eager to help other young people navigating the program. "You saved my life," Marcus told Thomas one afternoon, his voice full of gratitude. Thomas gently corrected him. "No, Marcus, you saved your own life. You showed up every single day. You put in the hard work. You refused to give up, even when it was tough. I just gave you the tools, the guidance. You did more than that." Marcus was insistent, though. "You believed in me, Thomas. You believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. That's what saved me. That's the truth." Thomas was struck by the echo of William's words from years ago, how he'd said almost the exact same thing to him. "Then pay it forward," Thomas urged Marcus. "Once you're stable, help the next person who needs it. That's how we truly change the world, Marcus. One person at a time. One act of kindness at a time." On a cold December evening, exactly 5 years after that horrific night, Thomas found himself standing in front of the very mansion where it had all unfolded. The Foundation was hosting its annual fundraising gala, and the event planner had specifically requested to hold it somewhere special, somewhere meaningful. William, without hesitation, had offered the mansion. Now, the grand rooms were filled with generous donors, dedicated board members, and the inspiring young people who'd been helped by the Foundation's vital work. Music filled the air, a cheerful backdrop to the lively conversations and easy laughter. Waiters expertly navigated the crowd, offering trays of delicious food and refreshing drinks. But Thomas found himself drawn outside, almost magnetically pulled to the spot where he'd sat with Eleanor, where they had fought to survive that long night, where everything in his life had irrevocably changed. The bronze plaque was still there, gleaming softly in the warm light spilling out from the mansion's windows. It read, "In memory of Eleanor Hartwell, who taught us that home is where someone waits for you, and family is who stays." A voice, soft and familiar, broke through his thoughts. "Still can't believe it's been 5 years." Thomas turned to see Lily standing there beside him. She was 15 years old now, tall, confident, and excitedly preparing to start high school. She had grown up so much in such a short time. "Seems like yesterday," Thomas said. a hint of disbelief in his voice, and also like a lifetime ago. Lily came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the plaque. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she asked quietly. "What?" Thomas prompted. "What would have happened if you had walked away that night? If you had decided that saving yourself was more important than helping Grandma Eleanor?" Thomas considered that, the shelter he had been desperately heading toward, the life he would have continued living, a life of cold, hunger, loneliness, and invisibility. "I think about it too," Thomas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But then I remember what my mom taught me, that you can't always see where a choice will lead. You just have to do the right thing in the moment and trust that it matters." Lily spoke firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "It mattered, Thomas. You mattered. You still matter." She wrapped her arms around him, and Thomas hugged her back tightly, holding on to this little sister who had become one of the most important people in his life. William appeared in the doorway, his expression warm. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "People are asking for you, Thomas. They want to hear you speak." "I should probably come in," Thomas said, feeling a wave of nervousness. "In a minute," William replied, stepping outside to join them. He looked at the plaque, at the very spot where Thomas had saved his mother's life. "You know, I come out here sometimes when I need to remember what's truly important, what really matters." "What do you think about?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. William paused, his gaze distant. "I think about how close I came to losing everything," he said quietly. "My mother, my humanity, my understanding of what it means to be a good person." He turned to Thomas, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I think about the incredible gift you gave us, Thomas. Not just saving my mother's life, but showing us how to live." He put his arm around Thomas's shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my son, Thomas, in every way that matters, and I am so incredibly proud of the man you've become." Tears streamed down Thomas's face, unchecked. "I'm proud to be your son," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, this unlikely family forged on one cold night and the unwavering choice to stay instead of walking away. Inside, someone tapped on a microphone, the sound echoing through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats," a voice announced. "We're ready to begin the program." "That's our cue," William said, breaking the silence. They walked back inside together, the warmth of the mansion enveloping them. The room was packed, filled with over 200 people, all there to support the Foundation's vital work. Thomas scanned the crowd, his heart swelling with emotion. He saw Marcus sitting with a group of other young people from the program, their faces shining with hope. He saw Mr. Rodriguez, who still dedicated his time to tutoring for the Foundation, a beacon of support for the young people. He saw Dr. Reed from the college, a champion of education and opportunity. He saw countless faces of people he'd helped, people who had helped him, people who genuinely believed in the mission. The Foundation's board chair, a woman named Helen who had been with them since the very beginning, approached the podium. 5 years ago, Helen began, her voice ringing with conviction. Something remarkable happened in this house. A young man with nothing gave everything he had to save a stranger. That single act of selfless kindness inspired the creation of the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. And in just 5 years, we've helped over 800 young people transition from homelessness to stability. We've provided housing, education, job training, and most importantly, we've shown them that they matter. She turned to Thomas, her eyes filled with warmth and admiration. Our Director of Youth Services has lived the experience of homelessness firsthand. He knows what these young people are going through because he's been there himself. He understands that the greatest gift we can give isn't just a bed or a meal, though those are certainly important. It's dignity, it's being seen, it's having someone refuse to walk away. Helen gestured towards Thomas, her voice filled with pride. "Thomas, would you come up and say a few words?" Thomas walked to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at all those faces, all those people who had come together because they believed in the mission, because they cared. 5 years ago tonight, Thomas began, his voice slightly shaky. I was 19 years old and homeless. I had nothing. I was nobody. I was invisible. He paused, the memories of that night flooding back to him. The biting cold, the gnawing fear, the crushing exhaustion. And then I found Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, lost and confused in the freezing cold. And I made a choice. I chose to stay. He paused again, remembering that night, the weight of his decision. I didn't know that choice would change my life. I didn't know it would lead to a family, a home, an education, a career helping others. I just knew someone needed help, and I was there. That's all. Thomas looked at William, at Lily, at the people in the crowd who had been helped by the foundation, his heart overflowing with gratitude. But here's what I've learned in 5 years of doing this work, he continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. That choice I made that night, that's the choice we all have to make. Every single day when we see someone struggling, someone in pain, someone who's been made invisible by society, we can walk away or we can stay. We can protect ourselves or we can reach out. We can hoard our resources or we can share them. His voice grew even stronger, resonating with passion and sincerity. My mother used to tell me that you're never poor if you still have kindness. She was right. Kindness is the one thing that costs us something and yet makes us richer. It's the one thing we can give away without losing. Thomas smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. Eleanor Hartwell understood that. She spent her entire life giving. And even in her final years, when Alzheimer's was stealing her mind, she taught us one last lesson. She taught us that being seen, being valued, being loved, that's what makes us human. That's what saves us. He looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of those who understood, those who had experienced the transformative power of kindness. This foundation exists because of one cold night and one impossible choice. But it continues to exist because of all of you. Because you've made the same choice. To see people who are invisible, to stay when it would be easier to walk away, to believe that every single person matters. Thomas's voice cracked with emotion, his heart overflowing with gratitude. Thank you for believing in this work. Thank you for believing in these young people. And thank you for proving every single day that kindness changes everything. The room erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, their faces filled with emotion. Thomas saw Marcus crying, his face wet with tears. He saw William beaming with pride. He saw Lily wiping her eyes, deeply moved by his words. After the speeches, the dinner, and the dancing, after most of the guests had departed, Thomas found himself back outside, drawn once again to the spot where it had all begun. The December air was cold, but not like that night 5 years ago. It wasn't dangerous, just crisp and clean and full of possibility. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Marcus approaching. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice hesitant. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," Thomas replied, offering a warm smile. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two young men who had survived impossible things, looking at the spot where everything had changed. "I got my college acceptance letter today," Marcus announced, his voice filled with excitement. "Full scholarship to state social work program." Thomas felt a surge of pride wash over him. "Marcus, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." "I want to do what you do," Marcus said, his eyes shining with determination. "Help kids like us. Be the person who doesn't walk away." "You'll be great at it," Thomas said, his voice filled with confidence. "You already are." Marcus looked at the bronze plaque, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think about that night a lot?" he asked quietly. "About how different things could have been?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "But mostly I think about how grateful I am for Eleanor, for William, for Lily, for this chance to build a life worth living." He smiled, his heart filled with gratitude. "My mom used to say that we can't always choose what happens to us, but we can choose what we do about it. I chose to help Eleanor. William chose to help me, and now we're all choosing to help others. That's how change happens," Marcus added, his voice filled with understanding. One choice at a time. One person staying instead of walking away, Marcus finished, his eyes meeting Thomas's. Exactly. Thomas agreed, his voice filled with warmth. They stood there for a while longer, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, contemplating the power of choices and chances and the strange, unpredictable ways life unfolds. Inside, through the windows, Thomas could see William and Lily laughing about something, their faces illuminated by the warm light. He could see Patricia fussing over the cleanup, her movements efficient and graceful. He could see the last few guests saying their goodbyes, their voices filled with warmth and gratitude. This was his family, his home, his life, all because of one cold December night. One old woman lost in the snow. One impossible choice to stay instead of walking away. Thomas touched the bronze plaque one more time, his heart filled with love and gratitude. He thought about Eleanor, about her wisdom and kindness and the way she had seen him when no one else had. Thank you, he thought, his voice a silent prayer. Thank you for being lost that night. Thank you for giving me the chance to be found. Come on, Thomas, he said to Marcus, breaking the silence. Let's go inside. It's cold out here. Yeah, Marcus agreed, smiling. Let's go home. And together, they walked into the warmth and light. Two young men who had been saved by kindness, ready to spend their lives passing it forward. Thomas Wheeler Hartwell stood at the front of a lecture hall at the State University, finishing his guest lecture for Dr. Reed's Advanced Social Work seminar. He was 29 years old now, working on his doctorate while serving as executive director of the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation. People always ask me, Thomas said to the 200 students in the room, his voice calm and confident, why I gave everything I had that night to save a stranger, why I risked my life, and my answer is always the same. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the diverse group of students. Because that's what we're supposed to do. That's what makes us human. He looked out at the students, some who had lived easy lives, some who had struggled, all of them preparing to enter a profession built on caring for others. It's not about grand gestures or heroic moments, he continued. It's about small choices made in critical moments. To stay or walk away, to help or ignore, to see people or look through them. Thomas smiled, his heart filled with warmth. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't a stranger for long. She became my grandmother. William became my father. Lily became my sister. That mansion became my home. But none of that would have happened if I had walked away. If I had chosen to save only myself. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. So when you face your moment, and you will face it, everyone does, ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be? The kind who walks away or the kind who stays? After the lecture, a student approached him, young, thin, with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Professor Wheeler Hartwell, the student said quietly, his voice barely audible. I need help. I aged out of foster care last month. I'm trying to stay in school, but I've been sleeping in my car, and I don't know how much longer I can. Hey, Thomas said gently, placing a reassuring hand on the student's shoulder. It's okay. We're gonna figure this out together. Have you eaten today? The student shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. Come on, Thomas said, his voice filled with compassion. Let's get you some food, and then we'll talk about housing and resources and next steps. Sound good? The student nodded, his face overwhelmed with relief. As they walked across campus together, Thomas thought about that cold December night 10 years ago, about Eleanor and William and Lily, about the family he had found, about the life he had built from nothing but kindness and the refusal to walk away. Why are you helping me? The student asked, his voice filled with confusion. You don't even know me. Thomas smiled, remembering asking William the same question all those years ago. Because someone once told me that you're never poor if you still have kindness, Thomas said. And because nobody should have to be alone, nobody should have to be invisible. I felt invisible for so long. The student whispered, his voice filled with pain. I know, Thomas said softly. I know exactly how that feels. But not anymore. We've got you now. That evening, after getting the students settled with immediate resources and a plan for the next steps, Thomas drove home to the mansion that still held all his memories, to the family that had chosen him, and that he had chosen right back. Lily was there, home from her sophomore year at college. She was studying to be a veterinarian, just like she had dreamed as a little girl. William was in the kitchen cooking dinner. He had become quite good at it over the years, finding joy in the simple act of feeding the people he loved. "How was the lecture?" William asked as Thomas came in, his voice filled with warmth. "Good," Thomas replied. "Helped a kid after. Reminds me of me." "They all remind you of you," Lily said, looking up from her laptop with a smile. "That's why you're so good at what you do." After dinner, Thomas walked out to the front steps, drawn to the spot where it had all happened. The bronze plaque gleamed in the porch light, a constant reminder of Eleanor Hartwell, who had taught them that home is where someone waits for you, and family is who stays. Thomas touched the plaque, as he did whenever he needed to remember, whenever he needed to reconnect with why he did this work. "Still talking to her?" Lily's voice came from behind him, breaking the silence. Thomas turned and smiled, his heart filled with love. Lily came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the plaque. "You know what I realized the other day?" she asked quietly. "What?" Thomas prompted, curious. "That night saved all of us," Lily said, her voice filled with conviction. "Grandma Eleanor, obviously, but also Dad. It reminded him what mattered. Me, it gave me a brother and showed me what real courage looks like. And you, it gave you everything. We saved each other." Thomas smiled, his heart overflowing with love. "That's what family does," he said softly. They stood together, watching snowflakes begin to fall. Gentle this time, beautiful, not the dangerous storm of 10 years ago. "I'm glad you found us that night," Lily said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'm glad you all found me," Thomas replied, his heart filled with warmth. Inside, William watched them through the window, his heart swelling with love. His children, thinking about his mother and how proud she would be. Thinking about the strange miracle of that December night. Thinking about how sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in a blanket of white. And Thomas stood there with his sister in front of his home, surrounded by love, living the life his mother had always wanted for him. A life built on one impossible choice made on one impossible night, the choice to stay. A voice echoed, "Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy."